All right, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all tonight, and we're going to talk about individualized education plan for or IEP for high school and what you need to know for transition planning. So, thank you for joining me, and hopefully, you walk away with some resources and ideas around what to expect during this transition, how to prepare, and what this looks like if you're new to high school. So first I want to say hello and welcome, and I'm excited for you to join me tonight. First, who am I? My name is Katie Jackson. I'm a special educator, educational consultant, advocate, and parent. So I own Northwest Neurodevelopment Center, which offers individualized tutoring and support for families. We also provide special education consulting and advocacy, and we support families through the IEP process, 504 process, and IFSP process. So we also like to be a community resource and share and support families through their journey and supporting their child. Besides being an advocate, I also am a parent of a child with special needs. And I too am going through the IEP process and supports with schools. So I have both the educator lens, consultant lens, and parent lens. So I'm definitely on this journey with you. So for today's agenda, our goal here today is you're going to know steps to prepare for the transition process. You're going to know communication and timelines, and also IEP supports in high school. So right now, especially with, I think, 3 weeks left of school or less, depending on, or maybe more, now's the time to plan for fall. So even right now, the IEP can be amended to include what is happening now. After the year we've had this year with a lot of changes and transitions, are there things that your child is receiving now that may not be on the IEP? So think about what are things in your child's IEP that have helped them accomplish their goals this year? What are the accommodations that are working right now? And are they documented? So when you're transitioning from one building to another with a whole new team, you want to make sure that new team knows what the current team is doing. And if you don't know what they're doing right now, these are great questions to ask your team. So also write about, like, I would just get like a journal, notebook, Google Doc, and write about things that have also been obstructive or unhelpful during the 2020-2021 school year. So what are some barriers you come across? What isn't working where you feel like, I don't want to bring it up. I know they're trying their best, but this isn't helpful. It's important that communication happens with the team, because it's not going to get any better with the new team. And it's good to document it now because it needs to be known. So the new team's not going to instantly know either. And maybe those teams can collaborate together. Document specific examples so that you can work with the IEP team. So if something is not helpful, or if something is helpful, give an example for why it's either helpful or unhelpful, because that helps with problem solving. And I always believe, and this is something I coach parents that I work with on, is always coming with a solution along, or with a problem and a solution. So if you're recognizing a problem, have an example of it, and then also think about, like, what is an idea I have, because you are an equal member of the team. So you may think you're not qualified to give input, but you also have more experience with your child than anyone else. So we're going to talk about the transition process, transitions that are happening right now. So based on some of the questions we received leading up to this event, there were some questions around other transitions. So I wanted to go over some of the transitions that are happening from kindergarten all the way to high school. So we have the kindergarten transition, so transitioning to elementary school from a preschool, transitioning from an IFSP to an IEP, the middle school transition. So we're talking about transitioning from elementary to middle school. And middle school really turns into your starting ground for what your child might need in high school. And I know the transition to middle school is hard because you're realizing like, oh my gosh, they're not going to have one teacher. They're not going to be at the elementary school they've been at since they were a little kindergartner. And then to go to middle school, instantly everyone's talking about high school. And you're like, wait a second, I just got to the point of going to middle school. I'm not ready to think about high school. And I was a former middle school teacher, and I would always bring this up with my sixth grade families about finding goals and supports now and fine tuning them by eighth grade. And these parents are still getting used to sixth grade. And here I am talking about eighth grade. But it's important to have that mindset, like be present where your child is now, but also think about where you want them to be in the future, and always have that lens when you're talking about supports. And then next is the high school transition. So transitioning from middle school to high school. And that's where a lot of this presentation is going to talk about. But I also wanted to recognize these other transitions. And so if there's some strategies in this presentation that would help you with any transition. So if you're here tonight and you're questioning about middle school transition, elementary transition, or kindergarten transition, you should be able to get some tips tonight too. So transitioning from an IFSP to an IEP, remember, what are your goals for your child? Make sure you document what is working on the new IEP. So you transition as you transition from the current IFSP. So I always tell families, like, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so you want to make sure that new IEP has all the supports you're considering, and you're not going to wait and see like, oh, I know this could help them, but we'll see how kindergarten goes. It's important to have that discussion with the team about your concerns and making sure you feel good about this IEP supporting your child in the fall. Transitioning from elementary to middle school. So first, you've been at elementary, that's been your home base. So now you're going to learn a whole new team when you've spent a long time with your elementary team. So first, you want to make sure you know who the contact person will be in the fall. A lot of schools can't tell you who the case manager will be until they know their staffing, and staffing's assigned, and that usually happens over the summer. So ask for a name of someone to talk to in the building, whether that's the vice principal, counselor, some consistent person. So you have a go-to person with all your questions, and making sure you get introduced to your new team in a timely manner. Make sure to document what is also working on the current IEP. So many times when teams have worked with a child for so long, they accommodate and they don't think to document it on the IEP. Oh, it's this thing we do. It's okay. We do it for all the kids. But even those unique accommodations people do for all kids, it's important when you're looking at individualized education plan, because the new team needs to know which accommodations work for the student and have been in place. Because if it's just a common thing everyone gets, but then the middle school doesn't have that or know to have that, then your child's going to not have that accommodation they're used to in their new setting. So this is your chance too to document the needs for middle school. So it could be a quick, I want to have an IEP meeting just to talk with the elementary and make sure the middle school team knows everything we're doing and everything's wrapped up for the fall. So you can request an IEP meeting to meet the new team in the fall also, but I usually recommend within the first month, so the new team has a chance to get to know your child versus meeting right away, because then you're talking and introducing your child, which is great. You can have like a quick informal meeting to just introduce who you are and how to support your child. But if you really want the IEP team to know your child, they need to have some experience with your child first. Transitioning from middle school to high school. So ask the team again who the contact person is, see a theme, who to contact, document what is working, and then this is your chance to get the needs for high school documented. And that's your time to talk about your concerns and making sure all the appropriate accommodations are in place and known in the fall. And then again, you can request an IEP meeting to meet the new team in the fall within that first month. So steps to prepare for transition. So these are all good ways to prepare for any transition. But when it comes to high school, know your goals for the high school years. So what's your target? Where do you want your child to be or teenager to be? In this presentation, I start referencing teenager because you have to think about they enter ninth grade. This is all new. So what are your goals? And some of that is related to where do you see them after high school? And that's a question I ask a lot of my families when I start working with them is where do you see your child after high school? So know what you're aiming for and also ask your child or teenager what their goals are after high school too. They need to start having that mindset of thinking about what they want to do, what's their interests, maybe trying some stuff. There's lots of opportunities in the high school years to get exposure to fields or areas of interest that will help a child or teenager decide where their passion's at. What do they want to do? Sometimes you have to try stuff to know it, right? So number 2, review all of your records and documents. So now's the time to make sure, do you understand the IEP? Do you have the most recent evaluations? A lot of times students are up for reevaluation sometimes that first year in high school. So if you notice that an evaluation's coming up, think about like, okay, when do I want the new team to test my child and see what their needs are? All that comes through reviewing your records and making sure you have everything before you move to the next school. Ensure that the current IEP reflects individual needs right now. So again, if there are certain things that are working, make sure it's documented and that the team has updated the IEP to reflect exactly what your student, child, teenager is getting right now. Also, again, know who to contact in the fall at the new school. So when I talk about your goals, what are your goals for your child? Where is your child at? Where do you want them to go? And how do you see them getting there? So these are all important questions to have. And these are all questions I have parents that I work with answer when it comes to the parent input and concerns on the IEP. This is a perfect place for you to write out your goals and where you see them and where do you want them to go and how they're going to get there, because it's important for the IEP team to know your input and make sure the IEP addresses all of these things and supports your child to get there. Communication and timeline. So the transition to high school. So we're going to talk about key points of transition and some action items you can do on this timeline. So the first point, which is right now and also over the summer, become familiar with your teenagers, high school, and staff. So go on the website, look at who's there, what their kind of mission statement is, what kind of things does the school is like, what kind of programs is the school known for? A lot of the high schools have things that they have a lot of courses in. It could be like more of an art focus, science focus, community service focus. So become familiar with everything about the school so you know what they offer and what opportunities are there for your child. Find out who will be your initial contact person and meet them. So And again, this doesn't have to be the case manager. This could be the principal. This could be the vice principal, assistant principal, counselor, who's that friendly face that you're going to know and say hi to, and also have your teenager know as well. And this next part is a big thing for me. And with it being towards the end of May into June, if you have an IEP meeting before the transition, make sure your teenager attends the IEP meeting. I always told my sixth graders, my expectation is that they would start attending their IEP meetings by eighth grade, because I wanted the eighth graders to know their IEP, what's in there, and be able to speak to it and give that input, because the IEP becomes their document in high school. They're going to be transitioning from class to class. They're going to have to advocate for accommodations, and they're going to be working on these goals that are going to support them post high school. So another thing I did too in the resource room was having my students know their goals and read their IEPs in sixth grade. And then when I did this progress monitoring and looking at their goals, I got their input on the next goal. So then they were empowered to speak at and attend the next meeting, because they know the data and they know the progress they've made. And I felt like that helped students arrive to the meetings and not feel nervous, because they knew what we were talking about. So that's just a little tip I have too for any teachers out there or parents. This is something you could suggest, that maybe your child is part of the progress monitoring and development of these new goals. So got on a little tangent there, coming back. So the next part on the timeline is when high school is just beginning. So you're going to get some information once you're registered at the high school. You're going to get registration information around orientations and open houses offered by the school. So my advice is to attend them. They're for the general population. Just because your child has an IEP doesn't mean that they can't access all these great programs and resources the school has to offer. So open events are how you will get connected and hear about new programs and opportunities offered by the school. There's awesome clubs and so many things to really get your student engaged in that environment and school culture, that it's important to stay connected and know what is going on. And really, by modeling you going to the orientations and open houses, it shows your student that you're also engaged in this, so they should be engaged. So also know how the school communicates any changes or new opportunities to their program offerings. So if they're going to add new courses or electives or clubs or sports, you know how to get that information so you don't miss out. Nothing's worse than hearing about something that would have been wonderful, but hearing that registration is closed and you can't access it. One of the programs that a lot of the Portland metro area schools are invested in is AVID. So advanced via individual determination. And AVID is an elective class that helps students move to that next level and be college ready when they're about B, C average students. So really giving them that encouragement to challenge themselves and enroll in challenging courses and think about where they want to go after high school, in college, all of those things. So that's an example of one program that if you didn't go to the orientations or open houses, you may not hear about it. Hold on, gotta drink some water. So throughout the high school years, take course selection very seriously. So many families that I supported while working in a school district didn't know how to select the right courses, or would assume certain courses were hard for students. So why try? And I helped a lot of kids forecast for high school. And when I did some work in the high school setting too, I would push my students, if they're on an IEP, let's say math is a weakness for them, Just because it's a weakness doesn't mean they can't challenge themselves or try to find other ways to meet that college, or not college, but graduation credits. So one example is the advanced programs. Sometimes they always had lower class sizes. So if I had a student that was really gifted in writing, but they never pushed themselves, I would encourage them to go into those higher level classes because I knew they could handle it, and being that smaller class size, they would probably absorb more from it. Sometimes the AP classes, they sound intimidating, but if you look at the coursework, they could probably take it with accommodations. And so I always looked at the individual student and their strengths and what's going to be hard. Algebra is really hard for a lot of kids. I know that like a lot of kids fail algebra that first year. So think about how you could support that. So through accommodations, breaking down the assignments, maybe beef up their math goal to support algebra more. Doesn't mean they need to avoid algebra or not take algebra, because you also want to make sure they're not set behind, while also thinking kids or students on IEPs have until they're 21 to graduate. So there might be some kids that could be A students if they only took a reduced course load. So this is all discussion. This is not my recommendation, but I'm just showing you how in high school, how you select your courses will set a path for your child. And it should be individual to what their needs are. And there's always ways to support them through these courses. And so I would make sure that when you go through the course catalog, you read and look at all the options and understand what those look like. So when it's recommended for forecasting, you understand what is being recommended, but also having back your mind, like, how does that relate to graduating? Are you working towards a standard diploma? Are you working towards a modified diploma? Because what you select ninth grade can put you on a track for certain diploma types as well. Students need to explore their interests well before graduation. So when we look at courses, and again, looking through the course catalog, if you have a child that's interested in robotics, there might be opportunities to take a robotics class and see if they like it. You want to get them interested instead of like senior year, I don't know what to do. Do I go to the community college? Do I go to college? Do I go to a trade school? What do I do? So there's a lot of opportunity in high school to explore those interests prior. So your teenager has a chance to explore what interests them. Make sure that your teenager is included in all high school has to offer and can access. So again, looking through the course catalog, being tuned in on clubs and opportunities. I know when I was in high school, I liked Key Club, and Key Club seems like a really easy entry club that gets you into community service, gets you to see other people who like to do community service. So how can you get your teenager connected and try to find interest, but also have them feel safe to try things. And if they're not good at it, it's okay. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to get A's if they're trying to figure out what they like. So when we talk about course selection, we have to talk about tools to support the student in courses, because you don't want their disability to be a barrier to being in a course that could help them in the long run. So accommodations and assistive technology your teenager needs for courses selected. So think about if a student, let's say with a reading disability, really wants to take British literature as an elective or English credit class, depending on what the school's offering. That's a lot of text to go through. So looking at assistive technology and audiobooks or text to speech for the student would help them absorb the content, but not be held back by their reading ability. So assistive technology can include a variety of tools such as speech to text, text to speech, Audiobooks and other possibilities. There's predictive text. There's so many tools and options out there. So don't get limited to just the small window of assistive technology. Part of the IEP is to always consider assistive technology. So if the team always says no to it, but you don't remember having a discussion, or maybe you're ready to talk about it, you can bring it up to the team. Okay, so can we consider it now? What's telling you that we shouldn't consider it? And the IEP team can do an assistive technology evaluation to determine what tools would be helpful for the student and give them access without holding them back. Because when you introduce a new tool, it can be a learning curve on adapting it to use that tool in real time, and some students don't want to stand out. So there's a lot of factors, and the assistive technology evaluation would help the team weed out the tools that aren't helpful and focus on what would be helpful for the student, and then add them as accommodations to their IEP. There's also person-centered planning. So that is a great tool. I know FACT Oregon has some templates for person-centered planning, and that puts the student first and their vision first when we look at the IEP and tools that could help them. And at the high school level, the student is in charge of that person-centered plan and explaining their vision to the team and how the team can support them in that vision. Communication during the high school years. So something I recommend to a lot of parents that I work with is to request a meeting at the end of each school year to focus on accommodations or other elements needed in the next school year. So if you've had a lot of progress and gains that's happened throughout the year, it's good to recap what worked and making sure the IEP reflects things that have gone well. So then in the fall, the team's ready to go with it. You can also, on the other end, ask to meet again at the beginning of the year to see how things are going. So with high school, you're always changing the general ed teacher. There might be some repeat teachers here and there, but your student is, or your teenager is getting introduced to different teachers, and they need to understand the accommodations. They need to know the student and what they need. So meeting at the beginning of the year is like passing the baton to the next team, and allows them to understand, because nothing's worse than hearing your teenager is failing right when it's quarter grades, because that affects credits. If they're failing, they could actually lose a quarter credit, and that would now result in credit recovery. And it's good to be on top of things. Like in middle school, a student could be failing and still get passed on. But in high school, you can fail and still get passed on, but really you need those credits to graduate. So making sure you are on top of it, or the team is on top of it together before you get so far into the semester that it's going to have a negative impact, when you could have just checked in and made sure everyone understood the accommodations and what that looks like. And I know it's the general ed teacher's job to know, but also having that meeting and having that reminder to check in and understand this student is really helpful. Also stay in regular touch with your contact person. So make sure if things are off, and also having the teenager also know who their person is and check in and do that frontline communication. But if you need to be that communication person first, stay in regular touch with them. So if there is something that's off, or if you're noticing something that's telling you that, like, maybe my child's really behind in things and I don't know where to start, that's your person. That's your I'm going to say lifeguard, hey, help me. I don't know what this is, or, you can talk it out with them and they can offer some tools and some suggestions, because they're also in tune with the resources at the high school. So they would be able to point you in the right direction if it's something they don't have the resources for. So also when it comes to communication, I think I brought this up in other presentations, is communicate in writing. So a paper trail makes it easier to track and follow up with. So sometimes phone calls are great. It's great to talk to a voice and get that feedback and not have to write it in the email. On the other end of that is it's easy to not follow up on. So if you're going to do a phone call, write an email to recap. Hi, thank you so much for taking the time for my call today. Here's the highlights from our conversation. I really appreciate what we discussed and look forward to the next items. So you bullet point everything you talked about, and it's now in an email for you to follow up on, for the other person to follow up on, and you know when that communication happened. Because if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And it's hard to follow up on. And being a former teacher, I can tell you emails are way easier for me to go back and reference versus my notes during a phone call. So IEP transition planning. So part of the IEP is also prepping for transition. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So post-secondary goals. These goals state what your child wants to do or achieve after high school. And these are the 4 areas the goals can be in. It doesn't have to be all 4. And the state template for IEP in Oregon has some of these areas outlined. So we have vocational training, example, learning a trade, post-secondary education, so college or other schooling, jobs and employment, and independent living if needed. So when the student starts high school, they've already started some of this post-secondary goal setting. There's a big push for college and career ready. So there's a lot of, there's like a questionnaire they do in the middle school around what their interests, like an interest survey, and what certain fields they'd be good in, and what are they thinking? Have they thought about if they want to live in an apartment? When do they want to work? What type of job do they want to work? Are they going to have a job in high school? You know, all of those things, so they can start thinking about how they're going to be independent after high school. So part of the IEP development is setting goals for post-secondary, and they're called transition goals. And the school, the IEP team is responsible to provide transition services and opportunities for students to work on these goals. So transition goals are just like an annual IEP goal. So it will look the same. It'll be labeled transition, and it has to be written with the result in mind. So maybe like a lot of the transition goals that happen in like 9th grade into 10th grade would be around exploring, like doing career inventories or questionnaires to figure out like what field they might be interested in. Or if you have a student that wants to be a scientist, they would be selecting courses or maybe advanced courses in science to continue that interest, to set them up for applying to a science related trade or college. So it all ties together, because you have to think about that transition from day one in high school. You have to think how high school is going to support them to transition into an adult. I know that's really scary to think about. I mean, being a mom, I can't imagine my kids as adults or what they need. So you have the IEP team to really talk and support you through it. And it's part of the IEP to support the child in their goals. If they want to work, maybe the first thing is studying to get their driver's permit if they want to drive to work. Maybe they want to take public transportation, so maybe they need to understand how to use public transportation. So really think about how they're going to interact also in the community to access work. So transition goals kind of cover that journey and where to start and what are the small little steps that the team needs to work on the student with to get there. Because if no one challenges that thinking or holds that goal to the child, like, oh my gosh, remember you want to do this when you grow up? Well, we got to start exploring these things and start thinking about it. You want them to get excited about it. And I would have a lot of students help me write my transition goals because they get really excited, or sometimes they're like, I guess I'll do this and I'll show you that I'm really not into that, but I'm going to do it because you think it's a good idea. And then they might like whatever we're working on. Because they are teenagers, so they're not always going to be excited. So something with the transition goals too is they still have to be measurable. So in other words, you have to be able to know if the goals have been accomplished. You can't just say we'll have a public transportation map and know where to go. Like, how do you know they know how to get there? How do they know how to find out what bus they have to get on? All of those things have to be mapped out in the goal to show that they have mastered that skill. Transition services. So once transition goals are set, the IEP team will decide what services your child needs to meet goals. The range of possible services is very broad, but it can also include, so again, doesn't have to include all of this, instruction and related services. So that's specially designed instruction through special ed on the IEP, community experiences like volunteer work, career and college consulting. So understanding if they want to go to college, maybe they start looking at scholarships to help them and what would be a good scholarship candidate for whatever scholarships are, because there's so many specific areas that scholarships offer. And so how can the students start the work in 9th grade to be a good candidate when they apply for that scholarship? Also help with daily living skills if needed. So it can be a combination of all 4 of these. Transition services. So these services must be reviewed and updated each year to support the transition goals. So if they need any of those services that we just went over, it's on the IEP, just like any other service. And as part of the annual IEP, they need to be reviewed, updated, discussed by the team. Some districts have transition specialists that attend the meeting, and their job is just to make sure the transition services and goals are appropriate and they have the resources to support the student. Services may change over time to reflect your child's developing interests. So maybe they volunteered at a vet and decided they do not want to be a veterinarian. Scratch that. They want to be a poet. That's really extreme. So the team needs to now go, okay, so what kind of skills do they need? What experience do they need to understand what this means? In addition to services, the IEP team may list accommodations too. So if there's certain accommodations they need for the transition services, it would be on there. And then as we talked about transition services, transition goals, the IEP process also is a big part of all these transitions that a student is going through, especially when you talk about the high school. So the IEP process stays the same from kindergarten all the way to graduation. So I have this last part of the presentation to talk about the IEP process. This is a process I've outlined in previous presentations, but I think it's important because when you talk about services and goals and supports, using the IEP process is the best way to make decisions as a team. And I'll go over what that means. So I've broken the IEP process down into 4 steps: evaluations, goals, supports and services, and placement. They're in this order because you need to have evaluations to inform measurable goals, which then outlines what supports and services the student needs, which then, looking at the goals, supports and services, placement can then be decided because we have data and we know what the student needs. If we don't identify the needs first, how do we know what the least restrictive environment is for that child? So the first step with evaluations are used to determine strengths, area of need, baseline data, and supports. And again, needs drive goals. So you have to identify them through evaluating, through assessments, informal and formal assessments. So a lot of teams will evaluate students in 8th grade to make sure the IEP has the most recent data for that transition to high school. So you want to make sure the goals are appropriate and that the IEP is ensuring the student will continue their progress. Present levels of performance are established using formal and informal assessments. So if they haven't been tested since 5th grade and they're going to be a 9th grader, the test that they had in 5th grade probably doesn't really accurately describe them. So I know with the pandemic and the shutdowns, a lot of teams did file reviews during reevaluation periods because it was hard to know what those tests really, like how accurate would they be given the COVID restrictions. Now that things are opening up more, there might be an opportunity for next year to do those evaluations. So really look over the IEP and make sure the data and those evaluations are within like the last like couple years. And if it's not, then you might want to tell the team, like, can we evaluate these areas in these academics? There's evaluations for transition as well. So if the team is developing transition goals, there might be some questionnaires or assessments they could do to know what areas of transition they need to support. So then you have your goals. So goals are developed from the information gathered in evaluations and informal assessments. Baseline data for goals are used to establish where the student is at. So the team needs to know where the student is at so that when they set the goal, that they understand the rate of progress that the student currently is making and that the student is able to make measurable progress over the next year. So they want to have realistic goals. You don't want to have this big goal and there's no data supporting it, but it's just like, oh, well, we hope the student's going to get there. When you hear a team say, hope, I think, maybe this is a good goal, those are all trigger words of we're not basing any of this on data, because if you had data, it'd be like, oh, the student is at this level. Over the past year, they made this progress. So I think the goal for this is reasonable based on the fact that they're right here right now. I know they can get here. So when you have data, it helps you look at that roadmap for the goal and see if it's attainable and that the student is going to make progress. All right, supports and services. So what supports and services are needed for the student to access general education curriculum and make progress on their goals? So this is the accommodations, supports for school personnel, if there's modified curriculum, all of that is under supports and services. And again, the support and services can't be determined until you know the goals. Goals can't be written until you have the present level, which is established through evaluation. So that's how the IEP process works. And when you look at the high school level, what supports and services do they need to access their classes? And that's always changing depending on the style of teaching their teacher has and uses, and looking at like each class on its own and what the expectations are, and then what services they might need or supports they might need to access what is being taught in that class. And then the last step is placement. So what placement is best to implement this IEP? In the high school, there's a variety of placements. There's general education. There's also specialized programs that have their own sheltered classes as well. So a student could have access to more general ed classes because they're not needing to be in the same class all day, like middle or elementary. And I'm being kind of general here because I know different districts have different ranges of placements. So you want to make sure the team is making a placement decision based on what the student needs and is outlined in the IEP, because the IEP drives placement. It's not a personal opinion or thought of where the student should be. It should be based on, they have these goals and services, and we know this about the student, so this is the best placement for them to access their education. Okay, and then I want to talk about advocating for your child. So when you work with a new team, you want to set the tone that you are an engaged participant in the IEP process. So these are 4 areas that you can set the tone. You want to review all your records and documents given to you by the team. So if they send you things ahead of time, or if you need things sent to you ahead of time to read, that sets the tone with the team that you're going to read every word on this document and that you are prepared to speak to it in the meeting. A lot of the parents that I work with, I try to encourage them to request documents ahead of time so we can review it together. I can get their input, because a big thing that happens is a parent goes to a meeting, the IEP is given to them in the meeting, they talk about all this new information, and then they're like, oh, that sounds great, right? We just wrote this, we read this entire IEP, this is great, you agree, right? Right. And you don't have time to process all of that. Your brain is still focusing on like page 2 of the IEP, because all that information is new and you're processing it. And sometimes when you look at something one day and then look at it the next, you have different ideas and opinions about it the next day. You processed it more. You're like, wow, does that make sense? Does that sound right? So requesting the documents prior to the meeting is a way for you to participate in the meeting, and you are an equal member of the IEP team. So to request those documents is okay. It is okay to ask for it. It is okay to tell the team, I need a copy of this IEP, the draft form, understanding that it's not predetermination, understanding that the team isn't saying this IEP means they've decided all these things. You just want to know the present level data, what the proposed new goals might look like. So you're able to then in the IEP meeting, talk about it versus reading it and understanding it for the first time. So also when we request those documents, give the team a date, give them a deadline. I need it by this day to be prepared for our meeting next week. If you don't ask or advocate for yourself for that, the team won't know to send it. I always sent it like ahead of time to my families, because I like to have IEP meetings when I was a special ed teacher, to where everyone's already reviewed the document and we can just talk about all the different areas as a team. What's your perspective? What's your input? So to have those productive meetings, I didn't want the parent to have to sit there and read this document the entire time. I wanted them to participate and give me their input, because you're the expert of your child. Okay, so moving on. Number 2, be an engaged member of the team and contribute your input prior to any meeting. So again, in preparation for an IEP or 504 or IFSP meeting, send the team what you want to talk about. What are some concerns you have? What are some strengths and interests about your child you want the team to know? All of that shows the team that you are going to be engaged and contribute during the meeting. And you're not just waiting for your chance to speak. You are giving them information, because everyone on the IEP team is collaborating on this document and giving all their information of what their perspective and input is on the student in their realm that they're working with the student. So why can't you give your input just like everyone else on the IEP team? If they're providing it ahead of time, you should too. Research your child's needs and understand how their disability impacts them. So Knowing your child's disability is really important, because then when teams suggest certain goals, curriculum, if it's not appropriate to a disability, you need to speak on it, because maybe the team doesn't know as much about the disability than you do. You want to make sure you know what they're proposing, if it makes sense. So it's important to be researched on that, and network with other parents and resources in the community. So knowing other parents is really important, because that's how you get to know like what resources are out there, what extra activities are available for your child. Also, getting connected with like Swindells, it helps you get access to resources that you wouldn't have had access before. And the community partners always keep you updated on what's new and what's happening, and new opportunities. So it's good to be connected, because that's how you hear about things that maybe you should advocate for. So most important through all of this, we're all in this together. Remember, we're all on the same team. Even when there was conflict at IEP meetings, everyone is trying to do what they feel is best for the child to help them make progress and have an appropriate education. So remember, through all the stress, we're all in this together, and we're all here to support each other, especially when we talk about community partners and other parents. So I always like to leave on that note to remember that we're all in this together. So thank you for joining me tonight, and I really appreciate you all being here. So we're going to have some questions. And then also later, there's going to be like a handout, or it might have already been sent, but there's a free resource I've created, which is an IEP meeting checklist for parents. So there should be a link to go and get the PDF. And part of that is getting added to my newsletter list or my email list, where I send updates and other free resources and information as I'm going through this sped journey too, and supporting families. I also create resources that I see families I work with need, and I want to share that with everyone. So let's stay in touch. So here's my email information. I also have Facebook pages, and then also have a free Facebook group. With IEP season, I haven't gone live as much as I would like, but I do live Q&As in that Facebook group, and that's a community of parents to help stay connected. And I know other parents share resources in that group, so that's a great place to start if you want to connect with other families or service providers. Also, I have my website for my center, which is www.nwndc.com. And then I also have Katie Jackson Consulting. So I have my own personal website with a blog that I started and then haven't blogged about, but it has some great resources on there too. And also there's the link for my email list. So I think that is it. We're ready for the question